All right, we're back, and it's Rapid Application Development, Lesson 4, Part 3. And we're talking about input validation. Okay, so again, what we want to do is we want to protect your app from errors. It's another form of error management, right? So we want to kind of say, well, we don't want the user to create errors, and users are notorious for trying to break your form, okay? Example would be if you're making a web form and they inject some kind of code in your web form to break it, right? It's very common. You've got to stop that from happening, right? Well, they can do the same thing here on a different scale, okay? They may not be able to inject HTML or something to break your form here because you're not listening for that, right? But on the website, definitely they can inject all kinds of stuff that they put into your into your string. Example would be you're running a PHP application and they throw down some, echoes and all this kind of stuff or different things, HTML code, and all of a sudden it breaks your code. It can happen, right? So you got to protect yourself. You got to, strip all the slashes out of their string, as an example on the HTML side, so that even if they put different control characters and stuff, it won't work, right? You want to stop them in some ways of breaking your form. Here we do it differently on the C# side. Right? What we're doing is saying, well, look, if the integer, I want to integer parse this hours text box, and if it's greater than 10, right? So I'm checking the ranges, right? Then, well, you know what? I want to pop up a message box that shows too many hours, invalid data would be the name of the message box, and then hit OK, and get them to redo it, and maybe reset their focus back to that form and highlight, select all that the part of the form that they're entering, right? Because you don't want them to enter invalid data. Now, I'll be honest with you, an alert box like this or a message box in C#, right, is a real annoyance to a user. If a message box pop up means you can't continue. It's a modal form that pops up. So there's other ways of doing it. But that's definitely one way of using message boxes for input validation, right? Here's another one. If name text box is not equal to, two quotations, it means, hey, it's not blank. That's what this empty string is, right? It's not blank. If it's not an empty string, right, that's good. I mean, you have some good data in here. It means that I'm getting some data that I can work with, right? If the name text box is not empty, right? Maybe this is where you'd put, you put this on the outside saying, okay, I'm not getting an empty string, so I don't want to just enter nothing. And maybe then you'd put this if statement inside this one as a nested if statement to check your data. So I'm not getting an empty string. I also don't have the incorrect values. So it's not, I'm checking for different types of errors that I can get in my code. Okay. So I want to perform multiple validations, and the best way to do that is the switch statement. So the switch statement, again, it's called case structure in VB and other languages as well. But here it's a switch statement. It looks very similar to an if statement in terms of the expression, the format. I recommend it if you're checking let's say you're checking multiple values for a particular expression. So let's say, for example, I'm checking an input. What did the user enter in? Is it a 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, whatever he's entering? And I'm checking a bunch of different values, and I want to have different results according to what he enters in that are customized, right? Well, then, a switch statement works the best, right? So the way it works is you put your switch statement at the bottom. You're going to put some kind of comment saying, and switch. You got to put that in there as well because you want to kind of put the comments. Because again, every time you have these braces, you want to kind of determine, hey, this is the switch statement that it's going to end here. This code block, right? And then what you have here is you have your case statement with a colon, and then anything that's inside between the case statement, between this colon and the break, right? It'll actually do all the statements in here. It'll kind of operate on all these statements. So one of the students asked me at one point, hey, how come they don't put extra braces in here? Could you put braces, underneath this case statement? And the answer is no. Please don't do that. That is not the syntax for this language, to put an additional brace to do a code block in here. The standard is you put a bunch of statements in the break, and the break actually breaks you out of this switch statement and back into the rest of the code, right? So again, and there's another thing you can do. You can check multiple cases without the break, right? So for example, let's say I want to check case 1 and case 2, and they were going to have the same result, right? Well, then you just take away this break statement, and it'll only go to the next break. So you can check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cases, and they all do the same thing, and they're different results. You can, and you only have these 5 things, depending on or regardless of the result, gives you one kind of output. Then you only need one break. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that if you don't know how to do that. Oh, you don't understand what I'm talking about. So here's a good example of that. So here's case 10 and case 9, right? So we're checking to see if my score integer greater than or divided by 10. What's my score integer divided by 10, right? So if it's 10, right? So if it's, obviously my score integer divided by 10 would be like 100 divided by 10. If my result is 10, then or 9, right? So that's why I don't have a break here. Then do this message label dot text is excellent score. Give a result to pat in the back, right? If it's an 8, some other message 7, and so on. And the default, if you actually put default in there, that means that all other cases are going to show your scores shows room for improvement, right? So, example, if it's a 6 or a 5 or a 4, it's going to just default to this, right? So pretty standard stuff. Definitely a good. I'm going to put this in here again, just to reiterate the need for internal documentation. Oops. End switch. Again, I find it necessary to do this kind of thing. You may think it's not necessary. You may sit there and go, Tom, I don't know why you put these end switch, end if, and try and catch and all that kind of stuff in there. I'm telling you, in a longer piece of code, it will mess you up because you'll sit there and go, what is this? This end bracket, is it for? Did I remember to put the bracket? Maybe IntelliSense did it for me. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I screwed up. Maybe I erased it by accident. And then I've got the syntax error. I don't know what the syntax error is. I can't find it. Right? Well, a lot of times it comes from these braces. So please don't forget, especially when you're programming a C-style language without IntelliSense or something else with, for example, in JavaScript, right? It won't error out, right? It'll just do it, and then it'll produce a problem, and you won't know what the issue is. All right. Yeah. You got it? Switch statement. Okay. Sharing an event handler. So this is like you've written your code, and this is really cool. Actually, we're going to try and do this. Let's pull up your Visual Studio and let's do it together. Okay, because this is going to require a little bit more finagling on your Visual Studio, a little bit more than you think. All right. You did it already, right? Okay. Whoever hasn't done it, it's a good opportunity to do it. So again, the way we do it is if you go to Visual Studio, and I got this like event handler I wrote called exit button click, right? From my exit button, right? If I move this over here, and let's say I just want to copy, and I want to paste another button called exit, and this time this exit button here that I've created, I'm going to call it exit number 2, or let's call this door number 2, right? So there's another way you can like exit the program. You can take door number 2 to exit the program, right? Well, guess what? My button is called, if I look at what the button is called, it's called button 1. That's not a good name, so I got to change that. So I got to maybe call it, let's just call this like, exit button 2, because it makes sense, right? Exit button 1, exit button 2. We know which one it's going to be. Well, we want both exit buttons to kind of hit on the exit button. It's going to do the same thing, right? If I have such a case, right? So I only want it to use this exit button click event. I don't want to write a new one, right? Well, again, I kind of showed you guys this last week very briefly, but you see these controls here on the properties sidebar here, right? You have something called events. So if you click on this first, right now there is no event handler for the click event, okay? I can pull down a menu and look at all the event handlers that have been written. I've already written one for exit button, and if I target this one, now exit button click is the same event handler for door number 2, right? And if I run the code, and if I click door number 2, it's still going to do the same thing as door number 1, right? The exit button. Because I can use multiple buttons to point to the same event handler. So that's the first step, first thing you can do, okay? You have to change what your event handler points to, and this is actually in the associations file that works behind the scenes for your CS file itself, right? So your .cs file it shows you your form, and then there's the design side where the association happens, and this is what you're changing here. Okay. So if I go back to the code, my code right now, it says exit button click, right? Now it handles all exit buttons. But you can actually refactor this thing, and there's something called refactoring. So if I click on the name of this thing, and I right-click onto it, and I go to refactor, right? I can actually rename my method or my event handler right here, right? I can call it whatever I want, right? And it's going to reassociate my name with everything else. So I can call it, as an example, my exit function. You know, I can call it whatever I want, right? And it's not a great name for it right now, but I want to call it that. And it's going to look for exit form. In exit form, it's going to look for this is going to be the new name that I use. So I click on OK. It shows me a preview before it does any changes of what it's going to look like. And if you notice, it's going to rename exit button.click _click to my exit function, right? And it's also going to do here in the designer. It's going to say, well, look, here are the two places in the designer that it's going to change. If you notice, this is the association. This.exitButton.click is plus equal to this new system event handler, this exit button click, as well as the same thing for exit button to click. This all happens in the designer, right? So it's going to change my associations as well. If I press apply, it changes the name of my function. Here it is right here. So now it's called my exit function instead of exit button _click, right? Something more that makes more sense. And if I go back here, it actually reassociates it here on the design side as well, right? So both of the exit and the door number 2 buttons that I created both point to this new my exit function method that I've written. Any questions on that? So I'm pointing, all I'm doing is these are pointers to point to the same event handler depending on which button or which control that I'm using, that the user is going to click on. It's going to respond the exact same way regardless of the button they click. Now, why would I need to do that? Anybody? Well, you're making menus, right? So this is the same thing. When you make a shared event procedure or a shared event handler, in this particular case on the C# side, whether you're doing it on the menu or a button, they're still going to point to the same code. You don't want the menu to do something different than the button, right? And you're not going to write the code for the button again, because that's just a waste of code, right? So you just want to use the pointer. You want a pointer to point to that code as the event handler, and that's what we're doing here. Okay. And this is exactly what I've done here. You can write, so what I've done in this particular example, I've used one of them, for example, this red radio button, right? And that's the first event. You just can click any of these things to make for example, for a checkbox, you can use any of these buttons to create this event handler, the standard event handler. And then what you're going to do is you're going to rename the event handler, right, to something else, right? The challenge is for an event handler for a checkbox, right, you want to know, hey, which button, how can I check which button was clicked if I want to say, well, if door number 1 was chosen and door number 2 was chosen, but I want to know which button I clicked. You can have that kind of functionality too, and there's ways you can do that. So if it's a single event handler, right, that you're using, you want to basically say, well, it's a radio button, right, that I'm checking. I know it's a button that I'm listening for. I'm listening for a button. It's either button number 1 or button number 2, but I'm listening for a button, when the button is clicked, it's actually going to return a signature of which button am I. It's going to say, here's the button being clicked. I'm going to return that as part of me clicking the button. It happens behind the scenes, and normally we don't care about it. So here's a piece of code. As an example, I kind of declare this color. I cast it as a color. I say my color is the selected color. If I was going to do the same thing for a button, I would say my button, right, is my selected button. I don't know which one it is. Door number 1 or exit button 1, whatever I've written here. I just cast it as my selected button. Okay, that's what I'm going to cast now. And then what I say is this. I say, I'm going to say my selected button, and this is my selected radio button, right? So I'm going to cast it as my radio button, right, is equal to, I'm going to cast radio button as the sender, because sender is, it's still, no matter what I get, I'm going to get the event as a signature in the sender variable, right? I'm going to recast that as a button, and I'm going to check. I'm going to say, well, depending on my selected radio button, the name of my selected radio button, I'm going to check, and here's the case statement. I'm going to say, case radio red radio button, in this particular case, I want to change my selected color to red. Case blue radio button, I'm going to change my selected color to blue. Well, let's do that with the buttons. Let's see if it works the same way. Right? So first thing I need to do for selected color, here's I'm doing selected color. I don't need this variable, but I do need this to do this. This radio button is equal to the sender, right? So I need to do something like that in my code. Okay, so let's go back to my code. Here it is. So I know the sender is going to give me the value of my button, and I got to output that somewhere. So let's create a label container to put that in. So I'm going to drop in a label. Here's a label in my little exit form here, right? And let's reorganize this label because the label doesn't really show me anything. So here, for my label, I'm going to rename the label. Let's say we'll call it debug label. Can I do that? Can I name this debug label? Is it acceptable as a variable name? Let's see. Right? I call it debug label. It hasn't complained yet. Okay, that's the first thing I want to do. And then I want to kind of put in here, I don't want to make it so that it's automatic. I don't want to have the auto size as true. I want to change the auto size to false. So here's my label. I'm going to resize the label so it's the size of my button, right? And I'm going to change the border style so it's a different kind of border style for my label. So I'm going to make it like a fixed single border style. And I'm going to change the back color of my label to a light color, like white, right? Do you see that? So here's my label. I've renamed, I've kind of reorganized so it's white. It looks like it's a regular label. And by the way, these are all the changes you'd have to document in your external code, in your external documentation, right? And I have this label, my text box is label. I don't want that to happen. I want to kind of eliminate what's in there. I don't want anything to be written in there right now. And I want to also say, well, you know, my label is called, like I said, it's got a name. It's called the debug label. This is where I'm going to throw everything, right? Okay, so I've kind of set this up. Let's go back to the exit button. Okay, so here's my exit function, right, that I'm using, right? And I've called it my exit function. By the way, not a great name, but I've done it for illustration purposes here. And I've got my variable integer, which does nothing. Who cares about this? I'm going to set this back to 0, right? Actually, maybe I'll leave it here like this because it'll stop the buttons from exiting for now. And depending on when my button is clicked, I want to create my selected button. So I need to declare something here on the top of my form, or on the top of my event handler for the button. So here's I'm going to cast my button. Button, and then it's like, you know, and I'll call this selected button, right? So I'm kind of determining, I've kind of created this variable called selected button, which I've cast as a button class, a button data type, because the button is actually an object that already exists within Visual Studio. It's part of our Visual Studio form now that I've been actually, when I drag all these different libraries in here and stuff, and it also includes the button. So here's my selected button. I haven't done anything with it, right? And what I need to do is I got to say not only this, but I'm going to make it equal to whatever my selected button is. I'm going to cast, right, my sender object as a button. Okay, so here's my sender object. I'm casting it as a button. So I know which button has been selected, right? And now I can use my switch statement, right? So here we go. I'm going to write my switch statement. So switch, I start writing it like this. Selected button dot name, because that's what I'm looking at, right? And here's the first thing I put in here is my braces, right? Because I start putting my braces for my switch statement, and I put in there and switch because I'm a nervous kind of guy when it comes to braces. I'm documenting as I go, right? And in here, in my selected button name, I'm saying, well, case, the selected button name is going to be exit button, right, by itself, right? Then, what do I want to do here? If it's exit button, I want to put my break in here, that's for sure, right? Well, if it's case exit button, then I want to break, and I want to change my label. So then debug label.text, right, is equal to exit button. right? That's what I want it to be, okay? If that makes sense. Well, there's also going to be a case where it's not the exit button, but it's exit button 2. Because I know that's what the other one is called, that I named it. So now I'm going to change my debug label .text, right? I'm going to change that to door number 2, right? Because I know that's what I called my other button from a label perspective anyway, right? And then I'll put my break in there. So if this works properly, I'm listening for the selected button that's been clicked, and I'm going to change my label when I click those 2 buttons. So I can control which button is being clicked. So let's here I start. And if I've done everything properly, if I click door number 2, then look, here's my ugly little text box, and door number 2 pops up, right? Or if I click my exit button, well, then the exit button is showing here as my debug label. So I can detect which button I'm clicking. And it's a really important thing to do because I need to know sometimes which button has been clicked, even though they perform the same function. Okay? Clear? So here I did it for exit buttons. It's the same thing when it comes to the example in the book is for, or online, I mean, is for checkboxes. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to save everything here, and I'm going to close this down, and I'm going to reopen my other solution that I've already got done for lesson number 4. And what we're looking on is this shared events code that I'm going to look at, which is very similar here. So I've got my checkboxes, and if I look at the code, here it is. So here it is the same kind of thing. I've got my radio button, and I've cast my radio button, the sender object, which is just an object. Remember, the object data type is a blanket, empty object. It's nothing, right, at the beginning, an empty object. I'm casting it as a button. I want to know which button. In this particular case, I'm casting it as a specific button, this other control, radio button, and I'm saying, well, when I cast it as a radio button, the radio button has a name property, right? And I want to know what the name of my radio button is, and I got to check for that name here in my cases, and depending on which radio button is clicked, I'm going to do different things, right? Same kind of idea. Make sense? Yes?
I'm just clarifying things. You said radio button check change.
Yep.
Does that mean every radio button visible on the form?
Right here?
Yes.
Yeah, because this is named radio button check change. But let's say, for example, I mean every radio button, because we've renamed the radio button. We just made one. We actually can create a radio button by clicking the radio button, double clicking, right? It makes a stub, right? Well, if you look at the actual form itself, just like I said, if I look at the blue radio button now, and I look at the event properties, it's going to show radio button check change because I've pointed all the buttons to that same, all the buttons are going to go to that same event handler. I've pointed them all there, right? And I've renamed it so that means any radio button check change, right? But typically when I create a new radio button, it creates its own stub and its own name. Like, example would be blue radio button, right? And all I've done is rename it so it's radio button. It means any radio button. I've renamed it personally, customized, by doing that, by using the refactor thing. And the way I did it again, just to reiterate, is I double-click the name, right-click, refactor, rename, and it renames that method whatever I want. And then I can point to it, okay? So that it makes sense in your code. You don't want to have red radio button and all the buttons are pointing to the red radio button because it doesn't make any sense, right? It has to be contextual, your names. And by the way, if you look at refactor, there's other things that can be done here as well that we're going to probably cover later on in the course. Like, for example, extract method. Okay. So, shared event handlers. You can also, we did this actually lesson 1, where you can actually call event handlers as well. You create an event handler. It's not really, you want to call the event handler when something is happening, and you can do that as opposed to letting the user click on the event. You can simulate a user click by calling the event anyway. And let's see how that works. We kind of did that lesson 1, but we'll do it here. So whatever the method is called, you just call the method and you put, like, the general form is that plus the parentheses and a semicolon. So here's the call statement example. Clear button click. I still got to, I got to kind of send in there the sender that I'm clicking and the E. I got to kind of put that in there. right? I got to send the sender across. Let's take a look at how that looks. So here is an example of this form, and there's another one for the calling event procedure. So if I go back to Visual Studio, and let's close this example down. And let's pull up the solution for the hands-on project, right? Or actually for lesson 4. I might have a lesson 4. I don't. Oh, here it is. So here's my lesson 4 hands-on. This is what it looks like. Here's my lesson 4, right? And what I want to do is when I click on New Order, it doesn't matter when I click on New Order. I also want to call this clear button click. I want to use the clear button procedure, and I'm going to pass in there sender and the E, right, for the event argument, right? I want to send in the event argument and the sender to my other event procedure when I'm calling it. And when I do that, it's like I clicked on that button at the same time. You can simulate that, right? And you don't have to rewrite your code. Because I've already built a clear screen function or a clear button function. Why would I write that again? It doesn't make any sense. I just want to call that code. So it's different than a shared procedure because I'm not writing a shared procedure for one button. I'm actually using another button, and it's doing other stuff, plus it's using that shared event procedure or handler, if you will. So let's take a look. So again, the New Order button not just does this, but also clears the selection as well. Okay. If you haven't been following along with me for Visual C Sharp, this might be a good time to do that because I want to debug. I want to do some debugging. So how do we do that? There's a debug menu on the top here, and then what this does is it continue for for the start button here, right? This one breaks all. There's little menu that'll come up when you're doing debugging, and if you look at Visual Studio, here it is. At the top of your menu, there's all these debug buttons. They're already here already, right? There's a step into, step over, and we've got to kind of go through how all this works. So let me just pull up my debug file. So I'm going to close the solution, and open up my other solution, and I'm going to call it. I'm actually accessing the debug solution that I've already sent you on Blackboard there. So here it is. Let's pull up the form. Here's the form that I'm going to debug, right? And if I go to the actual form itself, right now on the left margin here, and here's the gutter, right? This gutter right here. This is where I'm going to put my stop points. Okay? So how do we do that? So typically in VB, right, they get you to print out to the debug screen. But here, what they have for C# is we usually output to the console. Now, we haven't done a console output at all yet, but I think it's pretty valuable when you're running a code to kind of send some debug information to the console when you're kind of testing your code. You should really remove your debug information when you're done testing and you're ready to go to production, right? But here, we're going to use this console.writeLine with some kind of message that we're going to output to the console, and it's going to appear in your output window, okay, when you're running the code, right? So we're going to use that WriteLine method to output stuff when we're going to check some of your code. All right. And again, you can also you can pause execution by clicking on the Break All toolbar button, which looks like this. Again, going back. So here's the Break All toolbar button. It's a pause button. You can pause the execution, and you can start analyzing, different variables, what the value of different variables are within your code. Or you can actually put these breakpoints in your code as well. Now, this is a valuable way of doing stuff. Really useful, right? And what you do is you double-click on this gutter here inside Visual Studio, and it creates this breakpoint. And then what happens is, as it goes through your code, as your code executes, your code will stop at this breakpoint. So let's try putting this together. If you guys can follow along with me, so you know how to do debugging, right? And then if you haven't done this, it's okay. We're doing it now. If you've done this before, that's okay too. It's something you can learn here or refresh yourself. So here I am in my debug form, and I want to kind of look at the value of my quantity decimal. So when it gets to my quantity decimal inside my first try catch block, right? I want the program to stop. So I'm going to double click on the gutter here, and I insert a breakpoint. So it's in red, and it highlights the line that I'm going to stop in. Okay? And now I run my code, right? So here we go. I run my code. It pops up my my window. And if you notice, if you look here, there's a bunch of different windows that pop up here in runtime, right? Or debug time, if you will, right? There's an error list. There's an output window. There's a locals window. There's an autos window. There's all kinds of other windows. You can also make some customized windows as well. I want the output window first, that's for sure, because right now I haven't done anything, but I want my output window to work, right? Okay, so let's say I put in here a value like 25, right? So I want to have my quantity, my blue quantity is going to be 25, and I click calculate, right? Well, as we step through, it kind of gives me some information, right? It says here at debug time, I can actually look and see that my quantity decimal right now is equal to 0 because I haven't gone by this line. I've stopped before I've done my calculation, right? So this is my breakpoint, right? And I'm stopped here. Now I can use these different controls up here. I can step over, step into, or step out. Okay, they do different things. Okay, and I can also show the next statement. I can just continue my operation. So I go next, right? It'll show me whatever the next statement is down here, and there it is, right? So let's just step into, right? So I stepped into the code, and it goes to my if statement. Now if I hover over my buttons here, it shows me that my decimal value has been assigned to 25 because that's what I entered in here in my actual form itself. Now the form's not popping up because I'm in debug mode, but my input was 25. That's what I entered in, and that's what I'm getting when I hover over here, 25, right? So if you notice, it tells me what I'm doing here in my output menu. If I look at my locals menu, right, my locals window, it actually shows me the local value of my variables here. Total decimal is still 0, right? Because here I've defined two variables, quantity decimal and total decimal, right? And if I actually hover over them right now, I can tell you that in debug time, quantity decimal is 25, but my total decimal is still 0, okay? Because I haven't got to that point yet. And now I'm checking to see, if you notice, I'm on this, the yellow highlight tells me where in my code I'm executing. And now I'm going to step into the next one. Okay, so here I'm at the brace, doesn't do anything yet. Here's my code block. I haven't executed yet, and just here, my blue total decimal is plus equal to my quantity decimal, which is 25 right now, but my blue total decimal is still 0 because I haven't done this operation yet. So now I step into it again, step by step, and now my blue total decimal is equal to my quantity decimal because they're the same, because this operation has taken place. Does this make sense to you guys? Who has never done debugging before? Okay.
Well, not that kind of debugging.
Huh?
Not that kind of debugging. That's awesome.
It's good.
That's basic debugging.
You need to know how to do this stuff. In real life, this is the very basic of debugging that you can possibly do. Every IDE that's worth its salt, right, has this kind of, sorry to use that old term, has this this kind of debugging, whether you're using Eclipse or you're using Visual Studio or using NetBeans or whatever you're going to use for your IDE of choice. It's got to have some kind of debugging just like this where you can step into and out of your code, check variables, and all that kind of stuff at runtime so that you can see what's going on in your code. You're not guessing. Well, it should be 25 because I entered 25, but I'm not getting 25. Well, what's happening? And it'll actually show you how your code is functioning. So let's continue to step through. So if I go to the next one, it's going to say, sorry, I'm clicking the wrong button. It steps over that code because I've done that if statement. Now it says blue total text box.text is equal to my blue total decimal, which is 25, to string, but I haven't done this operation yet, and my blue total text box.text is now the empty string. If you notice, it shows you here that it's equal to the empty string, right? Down here, here's my locals window, right, and it's showing right now all it cares about is my quantity decimal and my total decimal. But look at this. It also shows me what my sender object is equal to, right, calculate, and it's also showing me my e-signature, right? E-signature. So it's X is equal to 33, Y is equal to 20, and my button is my left mouse button that's been clicked. Okay? What is this x equal to 33 and y is equal to 20? Anybody? Yes?
Coordinates on your form?
For the button is where I clicked. So it's telling me where on the bloody button my mouse clicked. Let's test that. All right, so let's stop debugging. Right, so remember 33 and 20. Okay? So if I go back here, and here I am again, and now on this text box I'm going to run it. Here I am, and now instead of 25 I'll put 32, just because I feel like putting another value. And I'm also going to change this, my selected color, to red, and then I'm going to click calculate. So here again, we come to this point, and now my quantity decimal is 0, my total decimal is 0, and guess what? My E is different, 26 and 17, because I clicked in a different place on the button, right? Still click my left mouse button, but a different place on the button. Why is that important? Who cares where on the button you click? Well, you know what? It's great information to have. Especially if you want to make the button do different things, depending on where you hover over the button and where you click. It's giving you more control. Yeah.
You could probably use that for visual effects if you're
Sure.
building something, so you get the I don't know, the metallic look around.
Sure, you can do all kinds of things, but depending on where you're moving your mouse, it'll detect it. You're actually creating an event. If there's an event, a hover event, right? Right. In this particular case, we're just clicking on the button in a certain place, but the hover event also sends its X and Y information into the event handler, all right, which is very, very useful. Well, and sometimes we don't care about it, like in this particular case. But sometimes you need to know if you're hovering over a certain area, especially if it's a picture, and you want to create hotspots on the picture based on coordinates, right? I'm just saying. Not that that's a great way of doing it. Okay, so we're going to step through it again. And if you notice, it's checking again to see if my blue radio button is checked. Right now it's equal to false. It's not checked because I haven't got to that point yet. And we're going to keep going. Well, what about the red one? Is it checked? And it's true, it is checked. So this one's going to execute here. Red total decimal is equal to quantity decimal. It's going to be the next line that's going to execute. Here it is. So here we go. It hasn't executed yet, right? But look at the locals window. It shows us the quantity decimal is equal to 32, and my total decimal still is equal to 0. Let's go back to the PowerPoint presentation. So this is really what it does. And you can toggle these breakpoints on and off depending on whether you need to use them or not. If you're doing you're going to debug your code, or if you're done debugging, you can take this breakpoint off again. And we kind of showed you this in a kind of a shortened way. So these are the things, these are the different options you have when you're debugging your code. You can step into, right, which is basically you're going one program, one executable statement at a time, right? Step over, it only executes one line of code at a time, but the difference between step over and step into is because it calls the next procedure, right? So it says code that calls to other procedures. Step over displays only the lines of code in the current procedure, not in that other procedure. So let's say, for example, I call another piece of another handler, right? I'm calling it. It'll do that stuff as a black box, whatever it does to its magic, and it'll come back, return control into my local function. Because maybe that local function is what I want to check, not that other event handler. Because if I go step into, it'll actually step over into that other event handler, then back into this one, right? So maybe we don't need to do that sometimes. So those are probably the two most useful ones. Okay. You can also make changes to your code as you code program. So let's say, for example, here, and I want to actually go into my code, so I'm still live here, right? And my code is still running, but I'm live, and I want to add another piece of code in here, right? Well, if I press enter as an example and say, well, I don't want just my red total decimal plus equal to quantity decimal. I want my red total decimal. I'm programming here as I go. So I think it's a good thing to do, let's say. Not that it is, right? I want it also to be plus equal to 1.0m, right? So now when I step over it, right, I'm going to step into it. I'm going to step here, and it's okay. At other times, what ends up happening is if you look at it, so here's my quantity decimal is 32, and I've also added another 1 to it, right? So my red total decimal is now 33, because I've actually made a change physically at runtime. I can do that too if I wanted to test another value, right, or change the code, because I thought in debug time this is a really cool thing to do. I have a piece of code that I want to implement here. But sometimes you'll get this crazy message if you do too many changes, it looks like this. When attempting to continue execution after making changes in debugging mode, sometimes you get this dialog box that says, hey, you're in a 64-bit program and you can't make this many changes. Be careful, right? So this is the locals window. We kind of talked about that, what it does. There's also the autos window, which automatically displays all variables and control contents that are referenced in the current statement. So let's take a look at the difference here. Here's the locals window. I'm only seeing quantity decimal and total decimal because that's inside this local function that I'm accessing, this calculate button click object that I'm at. And if I click the autos window, then I get, for this, all of the different options, for all the different variables in my entire document, right? Do I really need to know all the variables for everything here? Sometimes. Maybe I want to check different variables and different kinds of event handlers all at the same time, right? So this is where the autos window comes into play, and it's kind of a good window to look at. But most of the time, if I'm debugging, it's because I'm looking at a local piece of code that I want to debug through, and I don't need to see the autos output here, right? That's the difference between autos and local. Now, if you notice, there is this variable here too. So worst case, I could open this up too and see all of them here. So both windows kind of do the same thing. The autos just automatically goes to all the code, okay, or all the variables. Okay. Shifting back. Got a few slides left, and then you guys can go to your example, like many of you do. Actually, there's only one slide left. So that's it. Really, that's debugging in a nutshell. Your hands-on programming assignment is a little bit more complicated this time, and you're going to see them get just like this. They're going to start looking like assignments, little assignments, right? Again, I recommend as your homework, whether you do an assignment or not, you do these hands-on programming assignments from scratch. Please do this. This is great exam prep stuff, okay? If you don't know how to do this stuff, and we come to an exam time, and I do some little hands-on programming assignment that you need to do in 3 hours, which is exactly what an exam is going to be, right? So, and by the way, I'm probably going to do something I'm going to try and find something interesting for you guys to do, so you're not bored out of your head doing your exam, right? And I'm also not going to make you do something completely from scratch. It's probably going to be a modification of, here's a piece of code, modify it, make it work. It's broken, or it's not complete. Fix it. Debug, do this or do that. And if you haven't practiced doing that kind of stuff, you're going to go, I never really practiced debugging, Tom, and I don't know how to do that. Right? Can I leave now? Because I'm going to fail my exam, right? Or you'll lose marks or whatever, right? So here's some examples. There's a few instructions, right? And then there's some more instructions, lots of instructions on this one. Then they come up with some kind of sketch for you, as well as your objects and properties, which you should have in your external documentation at the minimum, right? Your event handlers or event procedures, and then your what the final form should look like. Okay, so you're going to get this almost exact same structure, or if you look at my assignments, they're going to look exactly the same. You'll know where you're getting marks on your exam, right? It'll look just like this. Don't be afraid of it, but don't avoid practicing and not doing your hands-on assignments, because you will be too slow at exam time. You'll be sitting there going, I know how to do this, but I don't know where that button is. So it's here. Here's the property. What does he ask me? I've never seen this before. I'm not going to ask you something you haven't seen before. And I'm not going to ask you to do something fancy that I haven't asked you to do in your assignments. So your exam is going to be based on, for week 7, right, what we talk about here in class, as well as the stuff that's on your assignments. Mostly the stuff on your assignments, because some of you don't show up in class and don't look at the videos and don't read my material. I know that, right? So we'll end it here.